I'm going to tell you some stories. And then we'll see what the stories will get us. Some of the stories are simple, some of the stories are very profound. All of the stories share a thread. The previous Rebbe lived in America for 10 years. He was an invalid. Begashmias, Bepashtas, he was a cripple. He was in a wheelchair, he could barely maneuver, he could walk with a little help, but he was very, very limited. And he had a nurse, a full-time nurse. That nurse was brought here from Europe. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe's illness literally saved her from the Holocaust. And she was with the Rebbe every day for all those years. And one Shabbos morning, the Rebbe was in his office. And the previous Rebbe's office is on the east, is facing Eastern Parkway. It's in the front of the building. The previous Rebbe's office is above our Rebbe's secretariat, and the previous Rebbe's bedroom is above our Rebbe's office. That's how it works. And the nurse was looking out the front windows, those beautiful windows, those stained glass windows, and she sees a chassid by the name of Michal Dvarkin, an old man. Michal Dvarkin lived in Israel. He had come to America with the Rebbe's permission, and he essentially lived here. He came to America for a visit and he never went back. He actually died here. He was one of the first people to be buried in the cemetery in Montefiore in 1949, Tafshin Tes. And the Michal Dvorkin didn't have a wife, he didn't have a family, he had a one-room apartment. So he went to people for meals. People fed him. He didn't eat much, but that's how he operated. So it was Shabbos morning, and he was walking on the opposite side of Eastern Park, directly across from 770, up the steps of the home or the apartment building that belonged to a chassid by the name of Berel Chaskin. This Rabbi Chaskin is his great-grandson. So the nurse says to the previous Rebbe, "Oh, at gate Michal is walking. At gates to Berel. He's going to Berel. He's going to get a cup of coffee before davening." The Frierdiker Rebbe is not looking out the window. He's at his desk. And he mutters, "Nein, gate to Yechanan." No, he's going to Yechanan. Yechanan Gordon was another chassid who lived the next apartment building over. So she's looking out the window and she says, "Gate to Berel." He's going to Berel. She's watching him walk down the path and up the steps. And the Rebbe says again, "Nein, gate to Yechanan." Anyway, to make a long story short, he went into the house, he knocked on the door, nobody answered, he went back down the steps, and he went to Yechanan and had his cup of coffee. The Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't spending his time following Michal Dvarkin around when he went for a cup of coffee with his Ruach HaKodesh. I'm reminded of there was a Yid here by the name of Pinya Altes. Pinya Altes was a very special chassid. He was a friend of the Rebbe, mamish a friend, an incredibly successful Askan. His only mistake he ever made in his life was that he died very young. He was probably 60 when he died. He was one of the most powerful presences of Lubavitch, and so he was very important in building Kfar Chabad. So he was here once, and the Rebbe sees him after Maidav and Rosh Chodesh. You said Yalav Yaveh. And before he had the chance to answer, the Rebbe said, "You see what I have to waste my Ruach HaKodesh on?" He had skipped Yalav Yaveh. He said, "You said Yalav Yaveh. You see what I have to waste my Ruach HaKodesh." So the Frierdiker Rebbe is sitting at his desk, and his nurse tells him conversationally, "So-and-so is going to this house." He says, No, he's going to the other house. He wasn't looking out the window. He just knew. Now, clearly, these are holy people who just know stuff. They know. How could you know where a man is going when his intention is to go someplace else? You just know the future. It's a pretty powerful thing. But if we could, so to speak, get past the wow of it, if we get past how incredible is that a person just knows everything that's going on in his neighborhood, he's just aware, he just knows. I would like to introduce to this discussion the following term. Clarity. Clarity. It isn't only that as a holy person he has special powers and the Eibishter allows him to know things other people don't know. It's the clarity of it. It's the simplicity of it. If a tzaddik sees a Jew cry at the other end of the world, that you understand. But that a tzaddik sees where a Jew is going for breakfast, that's not because the tzaddik is tuned into people, because there's nothing to be tuned into. He's going to go a cup of coffee. It's because the tzaddik just knows. The famous story that a chassid comes to the Holy Maggid, the musician, says, Rebbe, someone stole my film. He says, oh, so-and-so took it. But he's going to deny it. If you'll scream long enough and loud enough, he'll diminish it. So he goes to this person's house and says, give me back my film. Are you nuts? He starts screaming, you took my film. And he screams and screams and screams and screams and screams until this person, he thought he had done a perfect crime. Nobody caught him. So he knew certainly that no one had seen him. So he gives it back and says, but by the way, how did you know that I took your film? There was nobody around. They owed the Rebbe, the Maggid. The Maggid? So he comes running to the Holy Maggid and says, listen, Rebbe, I'm a ganef. But don't you have better things to look at? So the Maggid says, I saw that while in the bathroom, he answers in first days. I saw that when I was in the bathroom. I don't want to focus on the holiness of it and the in-tuneness. I want to focus on the idea that some people, their sense of their world is clear. And the clarity has a number of aspects. The clarity means everything is simple in front of them. But another very significant aspect of this clarity is that it's all part of a oneness, of a canvas. It's not they see this and they see this and they see this. They just see a picture. And the picture is the reality. The picture is the world. And everything has its place. And because there's such a clarity, when you will isolate one aspect of that reality and observe it to the Rebbe will also see it as part of that image, that clarity, that unity, and say, no. I just find that story so interesting. I find the story so interesting precisely because it's so not deep. There's no miracle. There's no magic. It's simply a Rebbe that klar, a Rebbe tzaddik sees clearly. There is a story which is bittersweet, maybe bitter, but certainly powerful. Along these lines, the Holy Maggid of Mezrich, the Alter Rebbe's Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov's disciple and successor, had a Talmud who was to a great degree a favorite of his, Mamish. His name was Rabbi Arna Godel Mikarlin. Rabbi Arna Godel, today there is a Chassidus called Stolin. Stolin and Karlin is the same Chassidus. The founder of that movement, the Jew by the name of Rabbi Arna Godel, he really is the first Hasidic Rebbe in Russia. Really. Before the Alter Rebbe, before the Middle Lithuanian. In fact, the Misnagdim used to call Hasidim Karlinim, because his branch of Hasidus was in Karlin. And in the documents when the Alter Rebbe was cross-examined, the Misnagdim consistently referred to the Hasidim as the Karlinim. He passed away at 30. So how much could he have achieved in 30 years? But he left an incredible impression. He left a 7-year-old orphan named Rabbi Karliner, who was the disciple of his disciple, of Shlomo Karliner. So Karlin became two branches. It was a Rebbe and a Talmud, and the first Rebbe's son, and then the Talmud's own son. So that's how it became. Rabbi Arna Godel Karlin was by Mezrich, by the Maggid, Holy Maggid in Mezrich. And he was leaving. So he went into his Rebbe, and he said goodbye. The Rebbe says, Fargus unto hate. The Mistama gave him his hand, I'm sure, and he wished him well, and he told him, we'll see you again. Zen, as they say in some cultures. As soon as the man Nagad walked out of the room, the Holy Maggid called him one of his disciples and says, do not let him leave. But of course, don't tell him I said. So the Talmidei Maggid, Tzadikim Gemurim, gathered around the man Nagad and they asked him where he's going. He says, I'm going home. I came to the Rebbe, I collected spiritual material to keep me busy for a time. I'm going home. He says, no, you can't leave. There's going to be a wedding, and there's going to be a bris, and there's going to be a maimah. They sold him the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Holland Tunnel, the GWB, whatever you want. And he began to question his decision. Maybe you should stay. So he went back into the Maggid again and says, Rebbe, the guys outside, they're on my case. I should stick around. Should I stay? Should I go? No, focus on the hate. Leave. As soon as he walked out, he called in the Chevra and says, don't let him leave. This repeated itself 3 times. And after the 3rd time, he left, and he never came back. He passed away. When word reached Mezrich that he passed away, the Maggid himself was devastated. I heard from some Hasidic Yid who told me that when the Holy Maggid heard that Rabbi Nagadol passed away, he said, "As Aaron neshai nishtu, habach nishvosatin of them ma'olam," which means in English, if Aaron is no longer here, I have no business in this world. That's how the Maggid felt about it. But they came to the Maggid and said, what kind of game is this? If the Maggid saw Clearly, the Mizitcher Maggid's desire to keep him there was to keep him alive. Tell the man! So the Holy Maggid said, based on the Pasuk, and there's a mind from the Alter Rebbe on this as well, there are certain tzaddikim that know everything. They know everything, but they're not allowed to say. God Almighty trusts them with all of His secrets, but He expects them to guard them. So whenever you have a fantasy about being a Rebbe, just think about how much information you're going to have about the future, and maybe you'll say, let somebody else have the job. But there's one exception to this rule. And the one exception to this rule are the nisyonos, are the tests of that tzaddik. And I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to give you several scenarios, which this will become very, very clear to you. Yaakov Avinu's son Yosef disappears. Jacob loses his favorite son Joseph. Yaakov Avinu thinks the child has been killed, torn to pieces by a wild animal. And he's devastated. And he mourns and mourns and mourns and mourns and mourns. For 22 years he never stops mourning. And actually says part of the reason he never stopped mourning is because he was still alive. And there's an energy in the creation that says that you forget the tragedy of death, but you only forget the tragedy of death if the death has actually occurred. If the person is still alive, that energy doesn't have an effect. And of course, part of the pain of the story is that Yaakov Avinu's father, Isaac, Yitzchak, is still very much alive. And he sees that Yosef Tzaddik is alive. And he's watching his son mourn himself into old age. And he cannot say a word. Yosef Tzaddik disappeared when Yaakov Avinu was 108. Yitzchak passes away 12 years later. More than half of the years that Yaakov and Yosef are separated, Yitzchak is watching his son suffer. And he doesn't say a word. He's not allowed. And Yitzchak knows with absolute clarity. The Torah says that his father was aware. Because tzaddikim are not allowed to reveal. But it's how the tzaddik knows. It's not just what the tzaddik knows. He doesn't know a bunch of details. He just knows. And when he zeroes in, they say when a tzaddik puts on his glasses, he's looking at one point. It's a big picture. Everything is in its place in relationship with everything else. It's a clarity on a level, to use a fancy mystical term. He doesn't know it. It's known to him. It's not Yodei, it's Yadu. He just has the clarity. Why doesn't Yitzchak Avinu tell Yaakov Avinu? Because God didn't tell him. Why didn't God tell him? Because this was Yaakov's struggle. It was Yaakov's Golus. The moment Yitzchak gives Yaakov this information, that Golus is cancelled. If that Golus is cancelled, the whole purpose which Yaakov Avinu was created, and his whole role in the evolution of the patriarchy that would lead to the birth of the Jewish nation and the giving of the Torah would be undermined, it would be offset. So Yitzchak watches Yaakov suffer and he cannot say a word. But he sees clearly. He sees past, he sees beyond. Move one generation later. Yaakov Avinu is laying on his deathbed. He's about to pass away. He knows, and he sees with clarity what's coming. That his children and grandchildren are going to be in the most miserable hell for a very, very long time. But he sees the end. He sees past it. He sees the redemption, he sees Matan Torah, he sees going into Israel, he sees Har Sinai. He sees the whole deal. His children gather around his bed, and he tries to tell them. He tries to tell them. And his Ruach HaKodesh departs. His divine spirit left, which either means he forgot, or it meant he still knew, but he understood that it was wrong for him to reveal. So he pulls back. He doesn't say it. Why? Because if Yaakov Avinu tells his shvatim, his children, when the Golus ends, he diffuses the entire Golus. Golus is Golus because it's not clear. Not because it's not painful, but because it's not clear. And this clarity is a gift that the Eibush gives tzaddikim. It's a clarity. It's a clarity. It's a clarity as if they could see everything. It's a clarity. And there are many, many stories to this effect. I'll tell you one more, which is very meaningful to me. But there are innumerable stories like these. The previous Rebbe said on more than one occasion that his father passed away prematurely. The Rebbe Rashab, the fifth of Bav, passed away in 1920, And his father said it wasn't his time. He died early. Why? So, of course, we don't know everything, but we know what's published, what's been made public based on talks and writings that are available to us. When the Bolsheviks came to power, first of all, I want you to know that the Rebbe Rashab was a Democrat. As soon as the Tsar was overthrown and they were democratic elections, the Rebbe Rashab said every Chassid must go vote, including the Chassidim who had their heads in the clouds and their feet in the mikveh. Everybody had to go vote. It was very important to him to try and establish a democracy in Russia. When the communists took over and they came into the city of Rostov, as soon as they entered the city where he lived, he said, quote, I cannot cohabit with them. I can't live with them. I can't. And he essentially wrote his own ticket. He pushed it. You read the story of his passing, you're reading the story of a man who decided he didn't want to live, so he stopped living. Simple as that. It's one of those remarkable stories of a completely healthy person deciding he's checking out, and he checked out. The story was Purim. The Hasidim came, 1920 now. This is Purim is, let's say, February, March, and there was martial law in the city. And if they caught you in the street, if you got a lot of people, you made a lot of noise, they would shoot you. There wasn't, they give you a fine or a suspended sentence. They would shoot you. The Hasidim who came to the Rebbe Rashab, who was living in an apartment building, didn't even have a home, were literally walking around in their socks, tiptoeing in. They didn't really sing. Everything was so depressed and so look. He was Purim. And at midnight, suddenly the Rebbe Rashab says, wait a minute. He turns to his son, the previous Rebbe, and he says, quote, Yosef Yitzchak, Simchas Torah mizrach of dem nish gericht. Simchas Torah, we did not see this. Which in itself is very significant, that a Rebbe shouldn't see something. Ich will es jetzt online with Simchas Torah. I want that now we should have Simchas Torah. And he said, the Hasidim bring a plate, and everybody should put money into the plate for tzedakah at the Rebbe's own discretion, which was a big crime. Bring vodka, alcohol, which is another big crime. Gather in a large group and sing. Those were the three sins which they could shoot you for. All three sins were gathered in one place at 12 o'clock at night. And they started to sing and jump up and down. The Frierdiker Rebbe was beyond himself, beside himself with fear. And the Rebbe says, poof. And agents came in from the KGB. They were not called the KGB. They were called the Cheka Guard. They kept changing the name. The Cheka Guard became the NKVD, and the NKVD became the KGB. Whenever they did too many crimes, they changed names and they collected a new collection of crimes. The Cheka Guard, they were the first. And they were Jews, all a bunch of Yiddelach, Yeshiva Bachrim, who were now not religious, but their entire identity was dedicated to the destruction of faith. And they walk in and they stand opposite him. He's looking straight at them. And he's mocking them and cursing them and belittling them and saying things like, to me, they're nothing. They're standing right there. He didn't say you. They're nothing. I'm not afraid of them. They're absolutely insignificant to me. These are Yiddish boys who speak Yiddish. He said, I'll say a Maimah Chasidus, and they'll completely vanish. And he said one of the most famous Maimah Chasidus, which is about the erasure of Amalek, the erasing of Amalek. Everybody was sure that the next morning they arrested him. I mean, it was so disrespectful. And nothing happened. This was Thursday night. That Shabbos, he said a Maimah Chasidus. Saturday night, he called on one of his people, one of his gabbais, and says, I need books. He had no Sfarim. His Sfarim were in a storehouse in Moscow, and they're still in the storehouse in Moscow. We're trying to get those books back all these years later. So he had no books. He gave him a whole list of Sfarim that he needed. And we found out later that the books in that collection were mostly Talmudic Sfarim, because he wanted to prepare a will. And he wrote the Rebbe Rashab's will is very long and very scholarly. No one's ever seen it. It's a secret. But it's apparently very, very involved. It's a scholarly will, a Lumdischer will. And for a week he was writing his will. A week. And the people who were closest to him saw that he was unbelievably preoccupied. Unbelievably preoccupied. And at the end of that week was Shabbos. Friday night he got sick. 1 week later he passed away. He was a completely healthy man, only 59 years old. It's a story, literally, of a man writing his own ticket. He saw what he saw. He didn't like what he saw. He said, I'm leaving this hell for my son. He checked out. It's a pretty cool story. It's an awesome story, but it's also a cool story. The understanding that we have of this story was that Rebbe Rashab said, I don't want anything to do with the Bolsheviks. But before he left, he completely discredited them. The significance of this discrediting of the Bolsheviks was seeing beyond them. The Rebbe Rashab sat at that Fabrengen and saw 1991. He saw the end of the Bolsheviks. I'm not afraid. I'm going to destroy them. The fact that it would take 70 years and millions of lives, including millions of Jewish lives, was in the big picture a detail. He saw past them. And because he saw past them, he didn't fear them. Because it wasn't his goals. It was his son's goals. And if I may interpret, his seeing past them and his complete disregard for them was in effect a koyach that should be ultimately defeated. One of the most incredible little details of Lubavitch history, which is not very well known, is this. The Rebbe Rashab, B'chalal the Lubavitch Rebbeim, always lived in a shtetl, in a small little village. When you live in a shtetl, there's never a problem with a mikveh, because all the little shtetls in Eastern Europe were built by a river. And rivers, at least for most of the year, are waters that are kosher for a mikveh. They're most kosher. It's meimaya. And of course, the tevel in a river can be kind of cold and kind of dangerous. They built a little house, and in the house they have a little box, and you dunk yourself into the box, and you're pure. There are certain complexities. Not all times of it does it work, but you never had to worry about building a mikveh and collecting rainwater. You had a river. When he moved to the big city, and not just he moved to the big city, all the Jewish people moved from the shtetl to the big city, all of a sudden there's no rivers. So he himself designed a mikveh. The Rebbe Rashab designed a mikveh of rainwater, mikveh of Mei Geshavim, which it's a famous mikveh be'lagavi. It's a long story, it's not important, the details. And he had such a mikveh built for himself in the basement of the home in which he lived. That home was evacuated by the previous Rebbe in 1924. That property was purchased by Gudas Tzidich Chabad, by Lubavitch, in the 90s, 15 years ago. Maybe 57, maybe something like that. And they came into the basement, and the entire mikveh had been covered over with cement. So they dug. And the water was still in the mikveh. The rainwater that was put into that mikveh, before the Bolsheviks was there, after the Bolsheviks fell. To me, this is awesome. It's very, very significant. This is clarity. Tzaddikim have a clarity. They see. But they see on a higher level. It's a higher kind of thing. It's a clarity. The Eibush allows tzaddikim to see. Why am I telling you all this? I am telling you all of this because last week we had a conversation. And last week's conversation was a continuation of the conversations of the weeks before. What was last week's conversation? We talked, in effect, about the idea that when we do mitzvahs, we're engaging in an entanglement, the opposite of clarity. We, in general, are entangled. We don't have clarity at all, right? I mean, if we only know what to do today from morning till night exactly, we'd be so happy to not, to have clarity about our decisions for one day. The world is confusing, it's distracting, it's entangling. Like the previous Rebbe calls it, there's no good without evil, there's no evil without good. So you never even know what's right and what's wrong, 100%. Sometimes something looks evil and it's virtuous. Sometimes something looks terrible, it's actually pious. It's so difficult to ascertain, to know, to get to the bottom of. And when you're doing a mitzvah, you're involved in material things. And that involvement in material things is the antithesis, it's the exact opposite of the clarity I just described. And the Alter Rebbe sung the praises of that. And said, you know why mitzvahs are special? Because you're getting involved in the quagmire, you're getting involved in the entanglement, in the lack of clarity, and through your effort, you do a physical mitzvah, you're disentangling the entanglement. Moreover, the same is true when you study Torah. Because sometimes you're studying Torah, and the Torah that you're studying deals with matters of law, of halacha. In other words, based on these learnings, you're going to determine how to do a mitzvah. So since by learning this Torah, you're going to do this mitzvah, and this mitzvah is bringing clarity to the world, so when you're learning the Torah, you're also bringing clarity to the world. And last week we added another dimension. And the other dimension, what happens if you learn those things in Torah that are totally impractical, that have no connection to a mitzvah? So the Alter Rebbe gave us a mystical conversation, which was quite interesting, that said, in effect, that when we involve ourselves in study of Torah in areas that are totally impractical, we're not disentangling entanglements on the physical level and bringing clarity to the physical world, but we are disentangling entanglements on some spiritual level, because every possible entanglement exists in fact in some spiritual plane. And when we study Torah in the most obscure, the most irrelevant, the most, the Rabbi Yirmiyah type of questions that are never going to happen, in some spiritual place that entanglement exists, and you're evening it out. You're disentangling it through your efforts. So it almost sounds like it's better not to know. It's better to be confused. It's better to be entangled. And to be sure, you know what's better? What is? The famous story with the Alter Rebbe, he heard his friends discussing what they would do if they were God. So one said, if I was God, I would be so nice to people, they'd be so spoiled, they'd come around to serving me. And the other one said, if I was God, I would be so draconian, I'd be so uncompromising, I would be so swift in my vengeance that no one would dare sin. And the Alter Rebbe in jest said, if I were God, I would do exactly what God is doing. He's pretty smart. The name is just ganz klug, you understand? But in last week's class, another point was made. And this final point I see as the carryover from last Igeres HaKedesh Kuntress to this one. And that is, after all of the advantages of the mitzvahs and the study of Torah that's halachic, and even the study of Torah which is non-halachic, in as much as there is an entanglement that you're engaging in to disentangle, there's something to be said for clarity. And if you hear last week, the Kabbalah of it is b'chokhmah is beriru. It's a Kabbalistic concept, very important Kabbalistic concept. Chokhmah is beriru means, in order to bring clarity to something else, absolutely, you have to be clear yourself. If you're not sure, you can't help somebody else be sure. Chokhmah is absolutely clear. Chokhmah is like this big tzaddik who just sees. And because Chokhmah itself is clear, it gives us the power to bring clarity to the world. In other words, we ourselves are part of the confusion. We're part of the entanglement. But because we have a connection to Chokhmah, we have a connection to the clarity that exists someplace else, or to say it in a very Hasidic way, to a tzaddik who has clarity. We have koyach from his clarity, that notwithstanding our own lack of clarity, we can bring clarity to the world. In other words, ultimately, if you're going to fix the world, you have to be fixed. But we aren't. And we're not going to be fixed till Mashiach comes, but we're linked to something or somebody that's fixed. In other words, there are two issues that are both vital. One issue is the whole idea that God Almighty created an entanglement and our task is to disentangle it. And the other issue is that there's something above and beyond the entanglement. Above and beyond the entanglement, there's an absolute clarity. This absolute clarity is not something that was once confused and was made clear. It's something that's absolutely clear. It's clear in essence. It's clear because it's connected to the Eibishter. And that's a higher concept. That's a higher concept. So as we move forward to this new letter, Igeres HaKedesh, one of the most famous and interesting letters in all of Kuntress, about Dovid HaMelech, and you'll see in Mitzvah Shem later on, what the issue is. The Alter Rebbe here addresses the advantages of clarity. The advantages of clarity. Let me allow myself more of indulgence. You were here last week, and I mentioned through the course of the class that the Gemara says that Reb Meir Sefer Torah had customized with an aleph. Remember? Hashem made for Adam and Chava a tunic of leather. In a Meir Sefer Torah, it says Hashem made for Adam and Chava a tunic of light. Remember that? Rabbi Meir, in other words, when you make a tunic of leather, it covers over the body. It shields, it hides. When you make a tunic of light, it reveals, it shines. For most of us, the Torah is addressing a darkness, which we want to compensate for and overcome by first not knowing and then knowing, by struggling and then gaining clarity. Reb Meir didn't have that. Reb Meir lived in a world of clarity, and he saw clarity. He looked, and everything in Torah, he saw clarity, and the world is everything was oyer. And notwithstanding how special and advantageous it may be, the effect of the disentangling, the entanglement, there is something to be said for clarity, then Claude, to see things clearly. And there is a lot of Jewish representation of this idea. There's a lot of ideas in Yiddishkeit and in Torah that represent this clarity. Okay? A Hasidic story as an introduction. There was a famous Hasidic Rebbe named Rebbe Uri Mistrelisk. Uri Strelisk. He was a contemporary of the Alter Rebbe's, I believe, in the middle of Rebbe. He's called in the Hasidic world Hasar of Mistrelisk. He was an angel. He was a completely godly man. And there was another Hasidic Rebbe who said to his disciple, I want you to travel to Strelisk, go see the Uri Mistrelisk, and you will see that he doesn't have a back. He has two fronts. He has two faces. Now, I want you to understand, he wasn't medically compromised. He meant spiritually. The back of his head and the front of his head was the same. Now, if you looked at the back of his head, you'd see hair. But if you would be a big tzaddik, you would see that it was exactly the same. So this disciple, who was himself a great chassid, tzaddik, of this particular Rebbe, I forgot the names, unfortunately, traveled to Strelisk, and he walks into the Strelisk's Beit Medrash. As soon as he steps into the threshold, from the front of the room, the Strelisk says, Zwei Penne mehr hab ich, vier Penne mehr hab ich. I have two faces, I have four. In other words, this also put him. The language that is used in Jewish theology is kulei ponim. Only a front. There's no rear. Everything is front. There's no acharai. There's no back. Everybody understands that anything that has a face has to have a rear. It's self-understood. There's the front of a car, there's the back of a car. Front of a person, the back of a person. How could you have a person that's kulei ponim? Because if you're only a face, there's no order. There's no earlier and later. There's no higher and lower. Everything is uniform on the same level. But there is a mystical concept that in this little episode that I shared with you, there was a tzaddik, a human being of flesh and blood, who was a representation, was an embodiment of kulei ponim. That there is a concept in mysticism called that some godly representations in this world are not only very holy, but they don't even have steps. They don't even have levels. It's all face. It's all the highest level. It's all the absolute level of godliness. Kulei ponim. There's only a face. There's no acharan. There's no back. What is the example for this? The Luchei Sabris, the tablets of the covenant, the holy tablets. The tablets of the covenant were cubes made of sapphire, precious stone. Right? Amo, Amo. And any side of the Luchos you looked at, you could read the Ten Commandments. There was no front and there was no back. When you take a stone and you carve a letter into it, so if you carve it all the way through, on the opposite side, you're going to have the letter inversely, backwards. The luchos were carved all the way through, and yet any side you looked at was the front. It's a miracle which is beyond imagining. Our imagination can't even fathom.
From the sides too, not on the...
For sure from the front and the back. You couldn't see which was the front, because there was no front, because there was no back. Chassidus explains that the face and the rear of Judaism are the light of God and the wisdom of God. The light of God is the face. The wisdom of God is the back. In other words, our ability to learn and understand the Torah. And by learning and understanding the Torah, we're having an access of Kfayachal, of God Almighty, the giver of the Torah. That's connecting to the back of Kadosh Baruch Hu, because you're not seeing Him, you're understanding Him. Those special people, or those special moments where a person is sensitive to the light, to the Eibshter himself, that's the face. The luchos had no acharaim. The holy tablets had no back. It was kulei ponim. In fact, it says in Gemara, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, I'm using my own words, that had the tablets not been broken, the Sefer Torah would have been Kulei Panim. The Sefer Torah did not have a front and a back. Both sides of the Sefer Torah would also be the front. You ever saw a mezuzah? You ever saw a mezuzah? On the back of the mezuzah, there's letters that go behind the divine names. Kuzu, Mushku, Kuzu. Whatever that means. It's not important at the moment. The Sefer Torah, in its first design, had the luchas not been broken, there would not been a front and a back. Both sides of the Sefer Torah would read the front of the Sefer Torah. What does it mean mystically? What does it mean in Avodah? What does it mean in life? It means this. If a person has eyes like Rabbi Meir, and he could see the godliness of a Sefer Torah, he doesn't have to learn the Torah. Because he sees it, he has clarity. If a person doesn't have light, and doesn't have clarity, he sees black letters, like I described them last week. But because you don't understand, you have to struggle. Had the first luchas not been broken, so the Sefer Torah also would have been kulei panim, would have been entirely frontal. There would be no rear. There would never have been the emergence of a Torah Sheba'al Peh. There'd be no Mishnah, there'd be no Talmud, there'd be no Halacha, there'd be only a Sefer Torah. You'd open up a Sefer Torah and you would know how to make tefillin. You'd open a Sefer Torah, you know how to make a mezuzah. The entire investment of the Jewish people would be in inspiration, in Nevuah, in prophecy. Not in study, not in understanding intellectual concepts, which is the back of the Torah, but in experiencing the light of the Torah. On whatever level, it's an effect, it's the concept of prophecy. And the Gemara says that the luch has not been broken, the entire Jewish literature would consist of 6 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the book of Joshua, that's it. And the book of Joshua would be there because that's our legal deed to the Holy Land. Where's the legal deed? Where is the shtar? Where is the legal deed that says we own Israel? It's the book of Yeshua. Because in the book of Yeshua, the maps and the demarcations of territories is very, very specific and very elaborate. Pages and pages and pages describing the borders of each one of the shvatim. Halachically, this is our deed to the Holy Land. And that's it. Why do you need to ask questions and give answers when you open up a Sefer Torah and you see? This is called kulei panim, completely frontal. And in the language of this conversation, this is clarity. Open up a Sefer Torah, and you see the light. It's not that you're smarter than the next guy, so you understand it quicker. You see a clarity, like tzaddikim, like big tzaddikim have a clarity. Since the tablets of the covenant, since the luches habris, since the holy tablets were designed, kulei panim, they were housed in the Holy Ark, the Aron HaKodesh. And the Holy Ark, as you know, had 2 cherubs, 2 kruvim that faced each other. The significance of the 2 kruvim facing each other is meant to symbolize the same idea of face to a face. It's not a face to a back, it's kulei panim again. And there was an interesting law, little detail, that governed how the Holy Ark was maneuvered. You have to understand, the Holy Ark was not exactly carried around on parade. The Holy Ark was in the Holy of Holies. The priest thought once a year in Kippur, that was it. But they did have to move it. They moved it through the desert. They moved it into Mishkan Shila. They moved it out of Mishkan Shila. It was taken away by the Philistines because it was erroneously taken away in battle. It was brought back to Israel by miracles. A whole long story. King David was relocating the Holy Ark. He was moving it from the home of a particular Jew to someplace else. Now what had happened was, during the reign of King Saul, a mistake had been made, and the Holy Ark was taken off into battle. And it was captured by the Plishtim, by the Philistines, who brought it to one of their 5 primary cities, and they placed it in the house of an idol called Dagon, base Dagon, which is a fish idol apparently. And when they came in the morning, they found that this house of worship and the idol had been vandalized, was chopped up into pieces, parts of it were by the door, parts were all over the room. And of course, it's pretty hard to prosecute a gold box with 2 cherubs on top. They realized after a while that there were no people coming and vandalizing their house of worship, their house of idolatry, but it was the presence of the Holy Ark. So they tried all kinds of different things. They moved it here, there. And they finally decided that they got to get rid of it. But they didn't know, first of all, how to do it. Second of all, they weren't sure if they wanted to do it. They wanted to be absolutely certain that they wanted to give this back to the Jews because they didn't want the headaches that it brought. So they did something most interesting. They made an experiment. They took nursing cows with calves. They harnessed them to a wagon, and they sent gold gifts, and they put the ark on the wagon. And they said, let destiny take its course. And these cows walked back to Israel crying. The Pasuk describes they went back to Jerusalem, they went in the direction of the Jewish people, crying, because they could hear their calves penned up. You understand? With the most unnatural thing. This wagon, when this wagon with the Holy Ark just shows up in the Jewish territory, the Jews, of course, were very happy. They put it in a special tent. It's a story with many details and a few stages of the episode. But this wagon was important. Those golden gifts that the Philistines gave, as evil as they were placed in the Holy of Holies later on. They were preserved, they were kept. The Mashiach is going to come, they're going to be brought out of hiding with all the other treasures that we have. And they decided to move it. But how are you supposed to move the Holy Ark? It has to be carried on people's shoulders. But in a very, very specific way. The 4 men who carried the ark had to face each other. In other words, if the ark has a certain length and a breadth, and there's 2 poles around either side, each person has a pole, the logical way for them to walk is 2 men are facing forward with their back to the ark, and 2 men behind them are also facing forward with their face to the ark. But the ark was not allowed to be carried that way. Everybody had to face it. So the men who were walking in the front of the ark were walking backwards. And the reason was the same, because everything about the Holy Ark represented, it symbolized, it had to do with this realm of clarity. And as I described to you in my introduction and in my stories, what clarity means. You see the Eibishter. The Luchas Abris, the holy tablets represent this. And oh, by the way, understand, when the Luchas were broken, and we got the second set of tablets, the second set of tablets were the same as the first set. They maintained that clarity, that only front, there was no rear. But the Sefer Torah now has a panim and achirayim. The Sefer Torah was demoted. In other words, the second Luchas on the outside were as great as the first, but the Sefer Torah has the panim and achirayim, which means for most people, they open up a Sefer Torah, they're looking at words and what they mean. Only people like the Rabbi, like the Arizal, like the Baal Shem Tov, they open up a Sefer Torah and they see what Rabbi Meir saw. Oyer mit an Aleph. So the Tanakh tells a story that King David, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, he was the chief justice of the Supreme Court. He was the king. But David HaMelech was the only man in Jewish history, besides Moshe Rabbeinu and Yeshua and Mashiach Tzidkenu, who doubled as the highest religious leader and the highest civil leader at the same time. In other words, King David was an incredible scholar. The Gemara says, Yodai melech lachis b'dam. King David, instead of being a king who could sit on a veranda and sip wine, spent his days paskening halachas. By day he was paskening shilas, and by night he was saying Tehillim. The man never slept. He didn't know how to enjoy life. He had all these palaces, didn't know how to enjoy it. David Melech Hashach Avakayim. He didn't have a minute for himself. And he was an incredible scholar. And he forgot this explicit halacha, and he put the Holy Ark on the same wagon that the Philistines had sent it back to Israel with. Now the Philistines sent it back to Israel because they were doing an experiment. They don't know the laws. They just don't want their holy places desecrated, vandalized by somebody that came and put in jail and prosecuted for it. And somebody died. Somebody very, very important died because of this. There was a punishment. And King David was devastated. He was so broken. And he cried out to God, how could you do this? And the Gemara asks the question. And this Maimed asks this question. How could King David have made such a mistake? You know, in Jewish law, they talk about Torah B'dvar Mishnah. A rabbi, somebody who has smich, who's ordained, who makes a mistake about an explicit halacha, is beyond the pale. it's so unacceptable that the halacha can be overturned. A rabbi makes a mistake, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't do what he says. He made a mistake, but you follow his law. But if it's an explicit law, it's not something that's subject to interpretation, and the rabbi forgot it, you say, whoa, cancel, start over. This is not a Torah without a Mishnah. This is a Torah without a Mikra. Dovid HaMelech didn't forget a law. He forgot an explicit pasuk in the Chumash. How could this be? The Gemara asked this question, and the Gemara answers that it was a punishment. King David forgot an explicit halacha and brought about the death of a very holy man named Uzzah, who perhaps was one of those people of whom it can be said that he had the clarity we described before. But you read how Dovid HaMelech was so shattered from his dying, it's clear that he must have been something very special. And the mistake that Dovid HaMelech made was that in his own personal life, King David, who was one of the greatest we ever had, who without doubt had the kind of clarity in Torah we described before, chose to celebrate the back of the Torah, the secondary aspect of the Torah, as opposed to the primary aspect of it. Dovid HaMelech made a mistake. And instead of focusing on what he knew was the deepest dimension of the Torah, the godliness of the Torah, the clarity in the Torah, the light in the Torah, he chose instead to focus on the secondary dimension, on the dimension of the Torah that deals with entanglement and disentangles it. And God Almighty punished him that he forgot an explicit pasuk in Chumash that Bakosef you saw that you're not allowed to put the Holy Ark or any one of the artifacts of the Mishkan into a wagon and schlep it by truck. It has to be carried on people's shoulders because he had made the mistake in his own personal life and prioritized the secondary aspect over the primary aspect of it. What's the story? The story goes like this. King David lived 70 years. And let's just say it wasn't a cakewalk. He did not have the easiest life. I mean, for starters, he was kept in the kitchen. They accused him of being illegitimate. His brothers looked down on him. He was an outcast. His father was this great tzaddik Yishai. And he was seen as almost illegitimate. In his own home, his brothers were so tall and handsome and sophisticated and respected. And he was the child that no one was supposed to see. Mamish, that's how he grew up. And then he became a shepherd. He was all by himself out on the hills with his harp and his sheep. That was the only peace he ever had in his life. And of course it all came to a crashing end when he killed Goliath, which is a good thing, yeah? But almost as soon as he killed Goliath, King Shaul became jealous of him and tried to have him assassinated and tried to kill him himself. And David spent years on the run. He watched his family. Shaul HaMelech wiped out his family in pursuit of King David, but never got him. But King David would never, ever pay back an eye for an eye. He never took vengeance against Shaul HaMelech. He could have killed him many times. Refused. The anointed one of God is trying to kill him. And he's just running away from him. And of course, the rest of the story, he became king. He spent most of his life fighting wars. At the very end of his life, his own son rebels against him and tries to have him assassinated. And it takes one more miracle of God to save him. He did not have an easy life. During one of King David's many crises, he had to run away from Eretz Yisrael. He ran away. He came to Gas, came to the very same place where the Holy Ark had been deposited after that war, in Beis Dagan. And he was depressed. And he was alone. And he was far away. And he said, Zmiros hoyu lichukecha beveis magurei. I am able to study Torah here. And the Torah that I study here gives me joy. This is what King David said. It's in Psalms. Zmiros hoyu lichukecha beveis magurei. The literal translation of these words are Zmiros, song, pleasantness. Were your mitzvahs, your commandment, your Torah for me, beveis magurei, when I was a ger, when I was a foreigner, I was an alien in somebody else's land. Now what's the crime? What's the crime? So there's a number of ways of explaining this crime. One of the ways, which is not so explicitly here, and this again is like Kaddish, but in Ayin Beis, you have a spariches. The word Zmiros which means to sing. But there are many words for singing. Shir also means to sing. Nigun also means to sing. The word Zmiros is used in the morning prayers. We call Psukei de Zimra, passages of Zemer. Why Zemer? Because Zmiros has another translation. In addition to Zmiros meaning songs, Zmiros also means to prune. You have a garden, and you have tomatoes, and there can be weeds, or you have to prune them. And the tool that is used for pruning is Mazmeres, Zemer. So Zmiros, means King David, I'm singing songs, and I'm pruning my enemies. I'm pruning evil. In other words, King David chooses to study Torah on what level? Not on the level of clarity. On the level of engagement with the entanglement to disentangle it. Now who could blame him? David suffered so much, and he, through his Torah study, took away some of the weeds and the parasites, spiritually speaking, metaphysically, they were on his case, and he was pruning, destroying spiritually all kinds of potential obstacles that may have come to his path, and so forth and so on. But it was a sin. If a person has a choice, as King David had, to engage in the study of Torah on the level of song, using the Hebrew word Zmiros, which means it's melody on the one hand, but it's engaging in the entanglement, you wish to disentangle it, to prune out, to eliminate what is not perfect about it. Rather than say, I'm Dovid HaMelech, the Eibush gave me open eyes, I can see what the Meir can see. And instead see the light of the Torah and the clarity of the Torah, which is not going to fix the world because it's simply above the world. But it's a much higher level. Is a mispriority. Misappropriation of priority. King David should have said, forget about my suffering, I can learn Torah. When I'm learning Torah, I'm in the Eibishter's world and have clarity. He chose instead to study a lesser dimension, study what you and I would call the rear of the Torah, the intellectual dimension of the Torah, where the Torah is involved in the mess of the world, because somehow that helped him deal with the mess in his own life. David HaMelech was punished for this. In this letter, the idea is explained a little bit different. David HaMelech says, I sit and study Torah and I rejoice. What's there to be rejoiced about? I look at the cosmos, I look at the universe, I look at the world, I look at the solar system, and I see something so incredibly massive. It's it's unimaginably massive. The size of the scope and the mass and the time space of the universe is beyond people's wildest fathomings. Numbers can say it, but we can't read those numbers and experience them. We just admit that this is the case. And David HaMelech looks at the entire universe and he says, this entire universe is nourished by one Jew who does one mitzvah. And when you sit and study a halacha about how to bring a korban, and if I do it correctly, it has this incredibly profound effect. If I do it incorrectly, because there was the smallest infraction, it has zero effect. Or if I have a pair of tefillin, and if the tefillin are compromised in the slightest way, it's nothing. But if the tefillin are kosher, the power, the energy in that tefillin is greater than the energy of the entire universe. There is more God in one mitzvah than the entire investment of God in creation. So King David was marveling. He would study the Torah and get such delight out of thinking, I am learning such a simple thing in the Torah, and this simple thing in the Torah is greater than the whole of the universe. But it's still a compromise. Because when you're David HaMelech, and you can study the Torah, and you could have the kind of clarity King David is capable of, what kind of world? What kind of juxtaposition? Why even bother? Why even say, well, there's a world. The world is so sophisticated, and the world is so massive, and the world is so involved, and the Torah is greater. A mitzvah is greater. A diktur kal, one little detail in halacha is more. It's completely removed from the world. So the Gemara says David HaMelech was punished for a terrible sin. What was his sin? His sin was that he chose to engage in a level of Torah that would make me and you the biggest rabbis in the world, the greatest scholars of today's day and age. But when you're David HaMelech, and you have the koichas of the Eibishter, of Ruach HaKodesh, to see the light in the Torah, and to appreciate the clarity in the Torah, and you choose instead to engage in a lower level of the Torah. King David was punished. And what was the punishment? The punishment was midah keneged midah. It was measure for measure. He forgot the idea that when it comes to the Holy Ark, everything has to be frontal. There's no acharaya, because of Yisrael. He forgot this idea because in his life he had placed the priority in his limud Torah on the secondary aspect rather than on the primary aspect. So what is this letter adding? And of course, the Alter Rebbe goes on to explain at the very conclusion of the letter that this is the ultimate reward, the ultimate end of Yiddishkeit. Because right now, for most of us, we're in the darkness and we're trying to find a little light. But ultimately, all of us are going to be given the opportunity to experience what people like Dovid HaMelech could have experienced, what people like Moshe Rabbeinu did experience, and all of the little stories and ideas that we shared that we'll all be able to get past, we'll graduate from the endeavor, the process of disentangling entanglements and and we'll all have this clarity. So what we have in effect, if I'm not wrong, is a letter which is a commentary on the previous letter, which was a commentary on the letter before that. The long essay explained the advantage of getting involved in the entanglements. The previous letter continued and refined the idea that there is advantage of getting involved in entanglements. But don't forget, above all the entanglement is a clarity. And this letter says the clarity above the entanglement is so superior to the entanglement that when Dovid HaMelech made the mistake of enjoying the intellectual dimension of Torah as it is separate from that clarity, or enjoying the idea that Torah can fix the wheels and the wagons of the troublemakers in this world, rather than engage in Torah on a level where the troublemakers simply don't exist. Dovid HaMelech was affected a punishment that he forgot an explicit pasuk that says there are certain things in this world that are uncorruptible. Their clarity is absolute. I'm having conversations with my yeshiva bacharim. This language came up. He said there's many things that you need to prove. But there are some things that you simply cannot deny. That's this clarity.